For just over 50 years, the media, true crime aficionados, and regular, everyday humans have been using a term coined to describe a strange phenomenon. At a time in someone's life where they should feel one way towards someone causing them harm, they instead develop empathy and even loyalty. Today we explore this well-recognized concept, surprising though it is, which refers to instances where captives form unexpected emotional connections with those who have taken them hostage or subjected them to trauma. Yes, friends, today we hop back across the pond to learn about a term I'm sure you've used and I'm sure you know, but do you know the whole story of Stockholm Syndrome? Welcome to Capers and Cocktails, a true crime podcast that doesn't take itself too seriously and gives you something to enjoy while you listen. The following content may be disturbing to some. Discretion is advised. If you're enjoying one of our themed cocktails, ensure you're of legal drinking age and have fun, but drink responsibly. Swedish fish, chewy fish-shaped candies with a fruity flavor, originated in Sweden in the 1950s by the company Malaco. Introduced to the U.S. in the 1960s through a partnership with Cadbury Adams, yes, Cadbury eggs, the candies gained popularity and underwent texture improvements in the 2000s. So if you haven't tried a Swedish fish in a while, they are way better than they used to be. With their distinctive appearance and taste, Swedish fish have become an iconic candy in American culture, making appearances in various media. While the classic red version is the most well-known, they now come in different flavors and colors if you didn't already know, so I guess check it out. And yes, we're putting them in a drink. Another modern one this week, and one that involves my favorite, an infusion. Thanks to Sweet Recipes for this recipe, which I'm pretty much using as is. Link, of course, in bio. For the drinks, you'll need to make an infusion. For the cocktail, take a half a cup vodka, and for the mocktail, take a half a cup non-alcoholic vodka, and add to both a handful of Swedish fish. The more the merrier. Let those infuse for 1 to 3 days, but closer to the one end of the days, they kind of disintegrated almost immediately, so I think shorter is fine on that. Then you can either discard the fish or eat them, but you should obviously eat them. For the cocktail, take 2 parts of the infused vodka and add 1 part cherry juice and 1 part raspberry liqueur to a shaker. Shake until well chilled and then strain over fresh ice. For the mocktail, take your infused non-alcoholic vodka and add to that 1 part cherry juice and 1 part raspberry juice or raspberry lemonade. I did raspberry lemonade. Shake, 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 strain, 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 and then garnish both glasses with some Swedish fish, of course. Yum. On August 23, 1973, a Thursday morning, Jan Erik Olsson entered the Credit Banken building in Stockholm, carrying a submachine gun. Known as Jan, the then 32-year-old had been born in Ekeby, a small locality in western Sweden, in 1941, in the midst of World War II. He grew up poor, according to him, and that only got worse after the end of the war. As a youth, he was incarcerated at a Swedish prison in Kalmar, a city in the southeast of Sweden, and he was pretty troubled, I guess. And while he was there, he met and befriended, Clark Oderth Olofsson. More than half of Clark's life had been spent behind bars in Sweden due to his convictions for attempted murder, assault, robbery, and drug selling. Clark had been dubbed a celebrity gangster, and the first one at that in Sweden. It seems like Jan was mostly just fascinated with Clark, or starstruck like the rest of Sweden, it seems. He would later say, quote, "Damn, I regret meeting that man. He's an effing jerk, really, but I felt sorry for him, and we looked up to him. He was so talented, and he had done a lot of things," end quote. Oh, and he didn't say effing. Listen, I said it once and I'll say it again. Maybe find better people to look up to. Anyway, let's go back to August of 1973. Jan may have stuck a wig on and he may have attempted to disguise himself with shoe polish or tanning cream, reports vary, but he definitely walked into the Credit Banken building with a gun that is more powerful than a handgun, but slightly less powerful than a machine gun, a submachine gun. He was holding a big bag stuffed to bursting with ammunition, explosive, clothing, and ropes. He shot at the ceiling and shouted in English, quote, "The party starts here," end quote, and demanded that the 4 bank employees lay down on the ground or he would shoot them. It was the beginning of a 6-day ordeal that would go down in history. The 4 bank employees were immediately taken hostage. They were 31-year-old Birgitta Lundblad, 21-year-old Elizabeth Oldgren, 23-year-old Kristen Enmark, and 24-year-old Sven Sofstrom. Jan would later say, quote, They were scared shitless of me, of course, and it was no wonder when I had shot at the ceiling and looked so wild, end quote. Jan moved the hostages to the bank's vault, a small, dark, and cramped space with no natural light. Meanwhile, around 100 police officers gathered and surrounded the bank, including snipers. Negotiators, including the primary contact for the week-long ordeal, Morgan Rylander, scrambled to get in contact with Jan. Negotiations were conducted through the bank's telephone line. Jan immediately demanded that police release Clark Olofsson from prison and bring him to the bank. Surprisingly, but maybe not because this is Sweden and not the United States, the police agreed to this demand. Once Clark arrived, at least one of the hostages, Kristen, saw him as their savior. She would say, quote, "He promised that he would make sure nothing happened to me, and I decided to believe him. I was 23 years old and feared for my life," end quote. However, Clark was, a criminal, and he took the opportunity to do everything he could to play both sides of the situation. He was even given the green light to have a phone conversation with the press and the actual Prime Minister of Sweden. Before they would free the captives, Jan and then Clark demanded a certain make of sports automobile in addition to a large quantity of money. They asked for 3 million kroner, which is around 46 million wildly inflated 2023 dollars. The police provided the kidnappers and prisoners with food and drinks, including beer. At one time, a mysterious substance was added to the beer by, the police. The hostage takers suspected that beer wasn't what it seemed, so they didn't drink it. Over the course of those 6 days, something unexpected happened. An emotional bond began to form between the captors and their hostages. Despite their dire circumstances, the hostages started referring to their captors by their first names. The captors allowed the hostages to watch television, gave them some of the tasty food from a local restaurant brought to them by police, and offered a level of psychological comfort. The hostages' emotions became increasingly complex as they began to experience a sense of safety with their captors compared to the police outside. 2 of the 4 prisoners, Kristen Enmark and Elizabeth Oldgren, displayed a notably more sympathetic attitude toward their captors than the other captives. Kristen was the one who was granted permission to speak by telephone with both the media and the Prime Minister. She attempted to persuade and argue with the Prime Minister in order to convince him to allow Jan and Clark to flee the scene without being hurt. Kristen would say, quote, "I'm not the least bit afraid of Clark and the other guy. I'm afraid of the police. Do you understand? I trust them completely," end quote. She would also tell the media that they were having a nice time, telling stories and playing checkers. As the days passed, negotiations between the police and the captors became increasingly challenging. The authorities spent many days attempting to bore holes through the vault roof. They intended to use the holes to discharge gas into the vault in order to incapacitate everyone that was inside. This would make it possible for them to storm the vault. Jan had tied nooses around the necks of the women who were being forced to stand on top of boxes whenever the cops began their drilling. The siege was broken eventually when tear gas was sprayed through the drilled holes, and the police forced their way into the vault. The siege lasted for exactly 131 hours, with the release of the hostages on August 28, 1973, and the arrest of Jan and the rearrest of Clark. I hope he enjoyed his weird few days sort of freedom, I guess. I don't know. Jan Erik Olsson and Clark Olofsson were tried and convicted for their roles in the bank robbery and hostage situation. Clark received an extension, actually, to his existing sentence for his involvement in the crime. He maintained, however, that he had nothing to do with helping Jan and that he had just worked to keep the situation under control in an effort to rescue the hostages. Later on, he actually did win his appeal in the Svea Court of Appeal, and he only had to serve the balance of his original sentence. Jan received a sentence of 10 years in prison for his crime. He became the object of affection for many women who would write to him while he was in prison. I guess he got his own taste of Clark-like notoriety and celebrity. The case was met with widespread public interest and curiosity, particularly surrounding the psychological bond that had developed between captors and hostages. The term Stockholm Syndrome was coined by the media to describe the psychological phenomenon that occurred during this incident. The case has been referred to in all kinds of media, books, films, television, further popularizing the concept. The development of Stockholm Syndrome is a complex and temporary psychological response that depends on various factors and circumstances. However, it is often linked to several key psychological mechanisms. 1. Survival instincts. Hostages may perceive their captors as life-threatening, leading to a subconscious strategy to reduce the threat and increase their chances of survival. 2. Cognitive dissonance, our favorite. Hostages may rationalize their captors' actions to reduce the dissonance between their negative views of their captors and their desire to survive. They attempt to reduce that mental discomfort that comes from trying to reconcile conflicting beliefs by rationalizing what their captors have done. 3. Dependency and basic needs. Captors control access to necessities like food and water, creating feelings of dependency. 4. Isolation and dehumanization. Isolated from the outside world, hostages may turn to their captors for companionship. However, it's important to note a couple of things. First, trauma bonding and Stockholm Syndrome are different things. While both instances involve the development of emotional connections as coping mechanisms, and victims in both situations may experience a sense of control or emotional attachment as they navigate the complexities of their terrible circumstances, Stockholm Syndrome tends to occur in situations of hostage-taking, where victims perceive their captors as threats and develop emotional bonds as survival mechanisms. In contrast, trauma bonding can manifest in various abusive relationships, where victims become emotionally dependent on their abusers due to a cycle of abuse. Stockholm Syndrome is relatively rare, primarily occurring in high-stress situations like hostage-takings. There's not a lot of hostage-takings, probably why it's rare. Anyway, trauma bonding, on the other hand, is more common and can affect a wider range of individuals in various abusive relationships. Stockholm Syndrome, a popular media and psychological phrase, actually has no DSM-5 diagnostic classification or criteria. It is instead a complicated psychological response to stressful conditions. Victims of Stockholm Syndrome may endure various psychological and emotional impacts, including confusion, fear, and self-blame. These responses can complicate the process of seeking help and healing. Victims may need professional counseling to address the trauma and develop strategies for breaking the emotional bonds they've formed with their captors or abusers. The case of the victims in the Norrmalm story robbery is not the only case of Stockholm Syndrome. Patty Hearst, the granddaughter of media mogul William Randolph Hearst, was the 19-year-old victim in one of the most infamous cases of Stockholm Syndrome in history. A group of armed domestic terrorists broke into Patty's Berkeley, California apartment on the morning of February 4th, 1974. Patty was kidnapped and forced into the trunk of a car as her fiancé was attacked. The kidnappers eventually confessed that they were members of the Symbionese Liberation Army and that they were using Hearst as a political and financial pawn in their struggle against the United States. This kidnapping was front-page news across the country. Patty Hearst's surprising decision to side with her captors and declare her intention to become a revolutionary in April 1974 was a major turning point in the case, obviously. After a gunfight between the SLA and the LAPD claiming the life of SLA Commander Donald DeFries, Patty joined in on a bank heist and began running around the country. After a brief manhunt, she was captured in San Francisco on September 18, 1975. She pled guilty to robbery charges and was given a 7-year jail term. Patty defended herself by saying she was brainwashed, or perhaps was suffering from a case of Stockholm Syndrome. The 2 years Patty was supposed to serve were reduced, and she was ultimately pardoned. And while the case was so named in the 1970s, that doesn't mean there weren't cases of it before this time. On the evening of May 27, 1933, 25-year-old Mary McElroy was taken from her father's house while taking a bath. 4 men, including brothers George and Walter McGee, forced entry with a sawed-off shotgun. They shackled Mary to a cellar wall in an ancient farmhouse after she got dressed. Mary, the daughter of Kansas City manager Henry F. McElroy, was a ransom target. After asking for $60,000, the abductors settled for $30,000 on May 29, 1933. Mary was found unhurt at a golf course. In less than a month, 3 men were apprehended and tried. Mary said she was properly cared for during her 29-hour detention, with 1 man offering her flowers. All 3 men received heavy penalties despite her sympathetic testimony. Mary was distressed and publicly expressed sympathy for her abductors and asked Governor Guy Brassfield Park to review their sentencing. Visits and gifts kept her close to the McGee brothers in prison. Mary had many nervous breakdowns after the kidnapping and its consequences. Her mental health worsened and she completed suicide on January 21st, 1940. Mary said in her suicide letter, in part, quote, "My 4 kidnappers are probably the 4 people on earth who don't consider me an utter fool," end quote. Sven Sofstrom, the male victim in the Stockholm case, actually visited Clark at least once when he was in prison. Kristen also kept in touch with Clark through letters. She visited him in a hotel room when he was granted day parole to go to his attorney's office. Their families even became friends. Following one of his many releases from prison, Clark Oderth Olofsson adopted a new identity, Daniel Demwank, and relocated to Belgium in 1991. Over the following years, he faced various arrests and convictions related to drug smuggling and other offenses, which resulted in additional prison sentences. In 2018, he was released from custody in Belgium and returned to Sweden as a free man. Jan Olsson became engaged and got married to a woman who, contrary to what some people claim, was not one of the previous captives. After his release, he spent 15 years in Thailand with his wife and child, where they managed a grocery store. Since then, he has relocated back to Helsingborg, where he ran an auto repair company and where he is currently enjoying his retirement. Jan would say that he wasn't surprised that the hostages felt sympathy for him, saying, quote, "I'm not violent by nature. I'm easy to talk to, easy to make friends. I tried to be as gentle as possible with them. It was only outwardly that I pretended to be tough," end quote. Jan has expressed regret for his conduct and has publicly apologized for the hostage scenario that occurred in Norrmalm Story. Brigitte Lundblad, one of the Norrmalm Story survivors, says that she does not believe in Stockholm Syndrome, saying, quote, "It is not that people in a vulnerable situation automatically ally themselves with their enemies and take sides against the outside world. You are forced to adapt. It's about survival," end quote. Thanks for hanging out with me. I hope you never find yourself in a Stockholm Syndrome situation. Sounds like not a good time, if you ask me anyway. Next week, we're exploring one of the world's first documented scams. And to go along with it, you will, of course, be enjoying one of the world's first documented cocktails. It's called, these pronunciations have been so hard today, the Sazerac. I even went out and bought sugar cubes to be authentic, and so should you. To figure out exactly what ingredients you'll need for next week's episode, you have to check out the description box. Also in the description box are all the links you'll need to get fully in the game of capers and cocktails. From social media to sources for each episode, you'll find it all there. After today, there are only 5 more episodes this season. Thank you all for sticking with me through the rebrand and change in the types of crimes we cover. I feel more and more confident that moving away from murder and towards capers was right for me, and so I hope it was also right for you. I'll see you next week, and remember, there are always alternatives to holding anyone hostage for any reason.